today's World Insight. Chinese President Xi Jinping in Moscow to cement relations with Russia. What's on the agenda? What's next for ties between China and Russia? And here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight coming to you live from Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in an ongoing meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow during this week. They are set to exchange views on issues of common concern. They said it's a gathering of friendship, cooperation, and peace. Many in the world are keen on how the Chinese leader's visit to Russia would weigh on Ukraine crisis. President Xi from China did say China will keep a constructive role in seeking a political settlement in Ukraine. His Russian counterpart expressed appreciation for China's role, and Moscow is open to peace talks. So what concrete efforts toward resolving the Ukraine conflict could be expected? And what are to be next for the relations between China and Russia? On these and more, let's loop in our panelists. Joining us, we have Sergei Senakoev, Deputy Chairman of the Russian-Chinese Friendship Association. He's also the President of Asia-Pacific Region Research Center. Meanwhile, we are also joined in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, Political and Defense Analyst. Last but not least, here in the Beijing studio, Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. The latest news coming in, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the Prime Minister of Russia, talking about concrete cooperation. He talks about a pragmatic cooperation between China and Russia. Now, to you, Mr. Senakoev, tell me more about these areas, pragmatic cooperation in terms of energy, strategic projects, and also improve the quantity and the quality of cooperation.
Okay, good evening. You're absolutely right that in our agenda of the summit, the most important is certainly our bilateral questions, and first of all about trade and economic cooperation. As you already know, we have comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction getting into the new era. So we already reached 190 billion US dollars turnover and are going to reach 200 this year, 1 year before it was targeted by the leaders of our countries. And this cooperation is absolutely comprehensive. As you already mentioned, it's not only energy, but also high-tech technologies, innovations, investments, construction of the very wide infrastructure objects, etc. So you are right, that absolutely right, that most important for us is our bilateral relationship.
Let's go to Mr. Rong about this as well. The bilateral discussion going on between Chinese President Xi Jinping and also the Prime Minister of Russia earlier did talk about many areas, especially coming from Russia. Trade, investment, for example, sir, energy and natural gas, peaceful use of nuclear energy as well, aeronautics, astronautics, and the list goes on. Of course, from the Chinese side, higher level and deepening cooperation in these areas. So how do you interpret? There are very pragmatic, long list of cooperation when it comes to pragmatic cooperation between the two countries.
Indeed, I think if you look at the relationship between China and Russia, if you talked about the pragmatic or practical cooperation, the list can go very, very long, even though over the past decades we have seen that thanks to joint efforts by the two leaders and the various governments, we have been able to achieve a kind of a relationship featuring we call comprehensive, multi-tiered, and has brought about concrete, specific, tangible benefits to the two peoples. The reality is that, the potentials are huge. So during the visit, we are expecting and certainly very much hope that the two leaders would work on to continue to push and explore more areas and new areas for cooperation. The issues, the areas we're talking about, some of them certainly I think has always been there on agenda, but there are some new areas or emerging areas that we're talking about. More importantly, I think the two leaders will also continue to work on to expand the scope of the cooperation, for example, sub-regional cooperations, cooperations covering beyond
Asia, for example.
Yeah, exactly, and also the quality of the cooperation, which is also very much important because China is pursuing a high quality development, and it also serves the interest of Russia to pursue to bring the relationship, bring cooperation to higher in terms of quality and, of course, quantity.
Of course, the two sides are still working at this moment in order to come up with some concrete steps to report to the international community about the bilateral cooperation. We are expecting that as it happens. But at the same time, many are looking at the issue of Russia-Ukraine conflict. And Mr. Felgentauer, to you as a defense analyst, we have seen both sides this time coming from China, Chinese President Xi, and also Russian President Putin, talk openly about how to seek a solution to the current crisis. Now, to you, how much space do you see both the public and the private talks between the two presidents will be able to open for possible settlement of the current crisis?
Well, Russia and China have lots of cooperation programs, lots of interest that coincide, but the Ukrainian crisis and conflict are overshadowing, as they're overshadowing almost everything right now for more than a year in the entire world. And when President Xi came to Moscow, the world was actually waiting and to see, can China really help to bring, if not a swift solution, any kind of solution, movement in the direction of the solution. Just recently, China managed a major foreign policy coup by bringing together old-time nemesis Iran and Saudi Arabia and in talks in China, and they resumed diplomatic relations. Can China do the same with Russia and Ukraine? Everyone's right now waiting, but it's going to be a very serious task because both sides right now are not so much inclined very much. Everyone says that they want peace, of course, but the positions of the two sides are miles apart, and many believe that that they can gain more on the battlefield instead of the table of negotiations.
Right.
So at least China could try to create back doors, I mean, a way for the two sides to just begin talking again.
Right.
Even that would be a very major step forward. And right now, everyone will be waiting President Xi's communication with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to see if there could be progress.
Okay.
Any progress would be good.
Right. We have been hearing from multiple sides about efforts needs to be made in order to seek political settlement. Though, Mr. Rong, China is the only country, major power so far, bring out a political settlement plan for both sides. Of course, these plans are not necessarily step by step that concrete, but it does illustrate some of the key principles. So to you, Mr. Rong, how much will that be able to bring both sides together? After all, they have to settle the conflict themselves. It's not China, but rather the parties involved, Mr. Rong.
Sure, I think that's absolutely the role China is playing right now. As a matter of fact, I think China, from the almost day one, actually the second day when the conflict broke out, China went in his talks with President President Xi made it very clear that this conflict has to be solved with political means and through dialogues. And ever since then, the position has been consistent and efforts has been continued. And the 12-point principles of China, put forward by China, the peace proposal, if I can say, laid out detailed and practical principles that have been for that. And the very purpose for that, China has made it very clear, is to persuade peace and promote dialogue. Exactly like the panelist, my fellow panelist, has said that at this moment, it seems that the conflict, directly parties to the conflict, while on the one hand, they are always very much, intransigent or insisting on their own position. But in the meantime, they're also looking for ways to, manage or to narrow their differences. And this role, unfortunately, nobody is playing. On the contrary, there are some other players, other major players. They do not want to see that happen. So China's role, the expectation of China on China to play a kind of role is very much there, and China's position is appreciated and is welcomed, like President Putin said when he meeting with President Xi.
Well, the document that we all mentioned about, and President Xi, of course, earlier mentioned in the meeting, is a 12-point position paper on a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis released by the Chinese Foreign Ministry last month. It shows the foundation of China's foreign policy, including respecting the sovereignty of all countries, and this is applying to everybody, abandoning a Cold War mentality, ceasing hostilities, resuming peace talks, and so on. President Putin said at the latest meeting that Russia has studied China's position paper and welcomes China's playing a constructive role toward a political solution. China is the only major power, as been mentioned earlier, that has clearly spelled out its basic position on the Ukraine conflict. Now go to you, Mr. Sendikoev. And by the way, thank you so much for waiting in the cold for us standing outside on this conversation. I want you to help us understand, among all of these points, which are, closer, do you see, to Moscow's ears, and with which point or which points among these that both sides you see can get closer in terms of a common consensus for negotiation or dialogue?
First of all, let me say that my opinion about this conflict situation in Ukraine, it's not simply a regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine. If there is such a simple thing that China has all its necessary resources to be to put all the sides on the table and to speak, to negotiate all about this. But the problem is that this is the proxy war between Russia and the West. And this is the most important, because in Kyiv we can see the puppet regime of the West. They have no even right to have a negotiation with Russia. And even today we already hear from Mr. Blinken or Mr. Kirby, they say no way for peaceful negotiations. So certainly this is most important, how we will deal with Western countries in this situation.
Mr. Rong, of course, I want to come back to you about the points made by our Russian guest. Once again, China is not a party directly involved in this conflict, but China is one of those countries that have trying to bring out some kinds of ways to solutions. Now, how do you see the various perspectives with parties involved or indirectly involved about the nature of this conflict and the solutions to this conflict?
Yeah, I think this conflict is very much complicated and at a deep-rooted causes. I think to get a better understanding or to get started for the talks and the political settlement that we are looking for, first and foremost for me, we need to look at the background. And the Cold War mentality, I think President Xi mentioned, and the Chinese position is very clear, because this is something I think goes deeper and broader context. And secondly, I think the principles like respect for the sovereignties and territorial integrity of all the countries in the world, big and small, weak and strong, and rich and poor, is also very much relevant. And last but not least, I think the legitimate security interests of all the countries should be respected. And of course, besides that, other principles of UN security, UN principle and purpose, and other, and so on and so forth. So let's agree with some basic principles, and let's see if we can start with these principles to see how to find a way together for a settlement of the conflict.
Mr. Falkenhauer, of course, a ceasefire is very important. That would make sure sides involved would have the possibility to talk to one another under not that harsh circumstances. So how do you see, though, that things are complicated on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are some interest groups in the world that are trying to having some kind of sour grapes, shall we say, phenomenon right now, when China is trying to, together with others, bring out some kinds of ways for a solution?
Well, ceasefire is a very complicated issue. I mean, technically, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
Stopping a major war, a major conflict like right now, what's happening in Ukraine, with hundreds of thousands involved on the battlefield and heavy losses, and that it just simply to stop the fighting requires, I mean, a very concrete negotiations on lots of details how you work it out. I mean, history knows instances when such conflicts were frozen effectively, like in the Middle East, but again, it requires a lot of work. And for that also you need to have the principle that both sides want to stop the war and actually want to stop it. And of course, there's also other forces to play, as it was said, that this is to a large extent a proxy war between Russia and the West. That means this is a very complicated situation. The Chinese plan contains fine principles with which anyone would agree. Basically, everyone agrees. But right now, I would say there's a lot of cherry picking, of some saying this is okay, but the other maybe not in this plan. So China has a vested interest, actually. Beijing has a vested interest in stopping this conflict. It's, I mean, everyone has a vested
Everybody
interest.
has a vested interest in stopping this conflict. That's why the world is paying attention, isn't it? When we talk about the proposals, of course, it's a lot of details that needs to be worked out. Otherwise, it would not be so difficult. But having a proposal in order, and also having the potential, both the potential and some kinds of capabilities, as well as trust to a certain extent from both sides and multiple sides, could be a starting point. And principles are also very important. Without principles, how can talk begin? China's Global Security Initiative, which is also related to the principle that we mentioned earlier, has also been one that would give a lot of ideas about what China has in mind. It's not about ego, it is more about how to settling things. Its core principles including staying committed to taking the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously, and also committed to peaceful resolving differences and disputes between countries through dialogue and consultation. Of course, these principles should be adhered by everybody, but when circumstances are becoming difficult, whether countries and interested parties will be still holding on to these principles is a test. And that's why principles at this critical moment are important. Coming to you, Mr. Rong, your two Russian counterparts based in Russia already expressed their views. Tell me more about, at this point, when there are so much spotlight on China in this issue and the bilateral relations between Moscow and Beijing, how is China likely to bring everybody onto the most important issues rather than being, shall I say, distracted by all kinds of opinions only?
I think the most important thing, as we have discussed, that we need to first and foremost to agree to certain basic fundamental principles. First and foremost, I think we have discussed about respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all the peoples. And secondly, I think the conflict, whatever conflict, in the end, would have to be resolved through political means. Will have to be resolved through dialogues. And no matter how complicated it is, this is, secondly, I think, as far as China's proposal or the 12-point sort of position paper is concerned, it also highlight or call upon some principles or some areas where I would like call negative list for conflict. For example, no attack on nuclear energy side, and to ensure the safety of food and security, supply chain, and so on and so forth. These principles, even though they are principles, but they are also very practical if we want seriously about to have a political settlement of the conflict. So these are the starting point. These are the basic things where I think China is pushing for. And once we agree with on this, and then we can start to work on other specific and more difficult issues. That effort makes sharp contrast with other players who does not want to see the ceasefire, does not want to see peace talks, rather want to add fuel to the fire.
Now, things are complicated, that's for sure. That's why everybody is looking at this every day. But a long journey has to start from step one. Without that step one, nothing can be ensured for the future. So that certainly is a positive step when trust to a certain extent can be won from both sides that are directly involved in the conflict. We'll see how things would go. But this bilateral visit by Chinese President Xi to Russia is not just about the Russian-Ukraine conflict. It is actually also about bilateral relations. Now, Mr. Felgenhauer, to you, at this point, we are seeing more intense interactions between China and Russia. Earlier, we already mentioned the economic, trade, investment, science and technology, and people to people even. How do you see at this point when Moscow is being isolated, quote unquote, by some parts of the world? China, together with some of the other emerging economies and developing countries, are still actively trying to interact with Moscow for the better of all.
Well, the China-Russia relations are becoming more and more important. They're more important for Russia. They're also important very much for China. And also there's the benefit of good logistics. There's a long border between Russia and China. And there's also, of course, the Central Asia through which both countries can also interact. Because, say, if with India or Brazil or South Africa, Russia has, of course, other BRICS countries, has relationships and trade, but there right now are serious logistical problems there. With China, there are not, and that's why trade is growing dramatically and will continue to grow, and also, of course, technological exchange and joint projects should appear. Okay. So this is very important, and this is going to grow, particularly with China, which is much better placed than other third world kind of, as they call them in Russia, friendly nations to interact. And China has much to offer to Russia. Well, and Russia has a lot to offer to China. It's a win-win situation.
Is a weakened Russia, Mr. Rong, necessarily going to help solve some of the current conflicts and also some of the issues that the world is concerned?
Well, definitely not. I think Russia is a major country. It's a big country. It's a big power indeed, and it's a member, a permanent member of UN Security Council. So showed us big responsibilities. And I think if you look at the challenges and issues facing the region and this world, I think the world needs Russia to play a constructive role. Need Russia becomes more stronger. I think more responsible. I mean, to more capable. I think to find or to find a way to address the challenges we are facing on energy, food, and everything. And that's why I think China is working very closely with Russia, not only in terms of practical cooperation that brings benefits, tangible benefits to the people, but also on issues like to improve the global governance, to find a way to address the issues, global challenge issues, and issues that are facing this world. And more importantly, I think we have seen that on the many regional and global institutions like G20, like SCO, like BRICS, and so on and so forth. China and other countries are working very closely with Russia and thinking that Russia is a country, is under power that can play a very important role in these areas.
On the other hand, we see some of the media report trying to bring China equals to Russia, or Russia equals to China, or bring the two together into what they call a group. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I really wonder, Mr. Rong, as a seasoned analyst of international relations, how do you see attempts like this? Very briefly, I think we have less than a minute.
Yeah, I think China and Russia is very proud of the relationship. This is a kind of new kind of relationship, a kind of fine example of a new type of state-to-state relationship that is not based on alliance, not based for confrontation, nor target of any country. This is a new type of state-to-state relationship, and China feels very happy and proud of this relationship with Russia.
Now, Mr. Falkenhauer, also less than a minute for you as well. How do you see the nature of this relationship and the way that both sides trying to shape it? Very briefly.
Both sides are building a partnership that isn't an alliance, but based on lots of mutual interests and mutual approaches to the world as it is today. If they manage to, together with Chinese help, to manage the Ukrainian confrontation, this relationship can really blossom. But that is right now the big cloud on the horizon.
Pavel Falkenhauer from Moscow, Rong Ying here in Beijing. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.